what we need to do to offer natural burials in Sarnia Lambton. You know, this is something that is becoming very popular in many countries. It's growing in popularity, including in Canada, but we're behind a lot of other countries. And there are some reasons for that. So we'll be exploring a few things tonight, but maybe I'll start with a land acknowledgement, if that's okay. We acknowledge that this land on which we are gathered today in Sarnia Lambton, sorry Gianna, is part of the ancestral land of the Chippewa, Odawa, and Potawatomi peoples, referred to collectively as the Anishinaabeg. It is through the connection of the Anishinaabeg with the spirit of the land, water, and air that we recognize their unique cultures, traditions, and values. Together as treaty people, we have a shared responsibility to act with respect for the environment that sustains all life, protecting the future for those generations to come. And natural burials fit in well with that land acknowledgement, with the spirit of it. And Brenda wasn't here when I talked to Gianna, but Gianna is joining us from Windsor, so she's not actually in Sarnia Lambton. So that's why I added that little extra bit there. So I guess we'll start screen sharing, and Leslie and I will walk you through the slides. This is probably about a 15-minute presentation, and then we'll have lots of time for questions and answers. So can you all see that?
Yes.
Yes.
So natural burial, presented by Alan McKeown and Leslie Checken. So the points to be addressed tonight: why is a natural burial the best option? Natural burial or green burial, basically the same thing. Where do natural burial grounds exist in Ontario? What are hybrid cemeteries? How do we promote this choice in Sarnia Lambton? What are the obstacles that must be overcome? And does Climate Action Sarnia Lambton want to advocate for Sarnia Lambton residents to have a natural burial? So some things to think about tonight. So we hope that the people of Sarnia Lambton recognize the benefits of a natural burial ground, providing an end-of-life option which is eco-friendly. So what is a natural burial? It's the most eco-friendly way of caring for our dead, and it's basically what cultures have done for centuries, up until recent times. So if we consider what happens with a natural burial below the ground and above the ground, below the ground, the body is buried in a biodegradable casket or shroud without embalming or a vault. If you don't know what a vault is, I'll get to that a little later. And the burial is shallower than in a conventional burial ground in order to maximize the benefit to the soil. So normally, you've heard the term 6 feet under. Most burials take place in 6-foot deep graves, but natural burials are only down to 3 feet, about half the depth. And that's to maximize the decomposition of the body and provide maximum benefit to the soil. Above the ground, this is what you see then when you visit a natural burial ground. It all looks very natural. It doesn't look like a cemetery at all. The land is restored to its natural ecosystem and protected forever. Individual headstones are replaced by a communal marker or no marker at all. And creativity inspires other organic land uses. So there's lots of things you can do in a natural burial ground just to enhance their value to people and nature. And I'll give you an example of that a little later. Do you want to add anything, Leslie, at this point?
No, that's great.
Okay, just jump in when you want to.
Thank you.
So let's consider what a conventional burial consists of. You know, here you have a very expensive casket made of wood and steel liner in the inside and metal attachments on the outside. So it's very heavy in resources. You know, the wood is stained and lacquered. And so there's lots of, you know, artificial chemicals and substances that go into the grave along with the casket. So it makes the funeral, first of all, very expensive for the family if you choose this option. And then the casket in most cemeteries does not go into the ground per se. It goes down 6 feet, but it goes down 6 feet into a concrete vault. Now, concrete vaults are just like a big concrete box that the casket goes into, and then a lid is placed on top. So it's really very unnatural because there's no contact with the earth at all. Concrete vaults are preferred by most cemeteries, but they're not mandatory. So you can have a burial without a concrete vault. The reason cemeteries like concrete vaults is that it stops the land from subsiding. If the casket was just put into the ground, it would eventually decompose and the grave would start to sink into the ground. So with the concrete vault, that doesn't happen. So it makes land maintenance a lot easier for the cemetery, grass cutting and all the rest of it. And so that's some of the other disadvantages of conventional cemeteries. They take a lot of work, a lot of lawn maintenance, ground maintenance, pesticide use, fertilizers, grass cutting, watering. And then, of course, there's the stone marker. So just thinking about that, an eco burial is a lot different. You know, it avoids all this stuff. And cemeteries and funeral homes are basically driven by profit, whereas eco-friendly places, natural burial grounds, are driven by passion to do the right thing for families and for the environment. Now, the traditional, this kind of so-called traditional funeral has been on the way out for the last 20 years. Most people now, when they die, are cremated. And at the top here, you see a crematorium oven. And about 80% of people now are cremated. And a lot of people are under the misapprehension that cremation is a green option, but it's not. It does save on land use, but cremation uses a lot of fossil fuels. They're usually fired by natural gas, and a lot of carbon pollution results from the cremation. Now, the two slides in the bottom do show you a modern alternative to cremation, which is known as aquamation or water cremation. I don't know if you've heard of this. Its technical name is alkaline hydrolysis. So the bottom left, here we have a female director showing you what the cylinder looks like. So the body is placed inside in the tray. And the disadvantage of this is that unlike a regular cremation where the casket is just put into the oven, with water cremation, the body has to be taken out of the casket and placed into the cylinder. So that means it can only basically be done in a funeral home because it has to be done in the presence of a funeral director who's the only licensed people who can handle dead bodies. So the body is put into the cylinder, and you can see heat elements at the bottom there. The cylinder is filled up with potassium hydroxide, which is a very strong alkali. And then when the door is closed, the system starts to heat up to about boiling temperature, boiling water temperature approximately. And it also starts agitating. And within a few hours, the body completely dissolves. And on the bottom right, you can see what remains. It's just the bones. So the fluid is simply drained off into the sewage system. And then the bones are put into a grinder and ground up into a fine powder, and given back to the family, just like ashes from a regular cremation. So if you live in southwestern Ontario and you want a water cremation, it would actually be quite eco-friendly, because most of our electricity that runs these machines comes from hydropower or nuclear energy. Very little is produced by fossil fuels. So you could say it's an eco alternative. Certainly much better than regular cremation, but it's not widely available, unfortunately, at the present time.
Alan, could I ask a question, or are we having?
Yeah, sure, Brenda. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I just wondered, because that's a highly alkaline material that's going into the waste. You know, is it non-neutralized before it goes into the sewer, or, I mean, that seems.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good question. I'm not quite sure. As far as I know, it's not neutralized. I think I think the argument is that, you know, it is diluted sufficiently when it's put into the sewage, but
The solution to pollution is dilution.
but yeah, that's a good point. I think we should look into that.
Yeah, I'll take that as a takeaway, Brenda.
Okay.
Right, right. So, so there are three options, although alkaline hydrolysis is still not widely available. I have heard maybe of a couple of places in Ontario that are offering it. So this is what an eco burial looks like. This particular one took place in England. There are lots of natural burial grounds in the United Kingdom and the US. The UK doesn't seem to have too many restrictions as to where these natural burial grounds can be situated. Unlike Canada, which is one reason we don't have very many of these natural burial grounds. So we'll talk about that later. But people who attend these eco burials are really very impressed by how meaningful they are. And this is just one quote from someone who attended one in England. Everyone who attended has stated a desire to be buried here. Difficult to describe the whole experience, as it was perfect in every way. Many thanks. So here you can see the friends and family are lowering the body into the grave down to a depth of just 3 feet in a biodegradable casket. So, you know, it's a hands-on experience. Families are involved and they really, really appreciate that. If they want, they can dig the grave themselves. So that's another option. And then after the casket is placed into the grave, they can fill the grave in themselves, which is also very meaningful for many families to be able to do that. And is not usually an option for traditional burials in Canada. So as most of you know, I'm a trained celebrant. I've done hundreds of funerals and memorial services, but I've never done a natural burial service. So I reached out to my colleagues on Facebook, my fellow celebrants, and asked if any of them had ever conducted eco burials. And several celebrants in the United States replied and said that they had, and they find them very meaningful and beautiful. And this is just one quote I've added from one of the American celebrants. And I can't remember if it was he or she, but they wrote, "At one of many I've had the privilege of conducting, I included passing the shovel at the conclusion, as folks could utter their gratitude for her life and to add soil. As we did so, her mother smiled and tearfully said, 'We're tucking her in for the last time.'" So as I said, families find the whole experience very meaningful, and to return a body to the earth, knowing that it's going to be taken care of by the earth and returned to the earth in a very natural way, I think that is so very, very meaningful to so many people. And it's certainly what I would wish for myself. So worldwide, there are over 300 natural burial grounds in the UK and over 240 in the US. By contrast, Canada has only 2 standalone natural burial grounds, and both are in the Gulf Islands in BC. There are others, which I'll explain in a minute. But fully functional 100% natural burial grounds, there are only 2 in the whole of Canada.
Wow.
And so, you know, we want to change that. And in this area, there are no options available. So what we do have in Canada, in addition to the 2 natural burial grounds, are what are known as hybrid cemeteries. And there are a number of these across Canada, but we need way more than what we have. So what is a hybrid cemetery? A hybrid cemetery is a regular cemetery which has designated a natural burial area as part of the cemetery. So you can see here the entrance to this cemetery. I think this is the one in Cobourg, Ontario. There's a sign that says, "For eco burials, follow the arrow." And that takes you into a part of the cemetery that is all natural and is available for eco burials. And realistically, for Ontario, that is probably what we would be looking for in Sarnia Lambton, to convince one of our local cemeteries anywhere in Lambton County to designate a part of their cemetery for eco burials. So here's some examples of these hybrid burial grounds. There's one in Niagara Falls, a creative 2-acre site with beehives, butterfly pollinators, a bench carved from a fallen ash tree, and a communal marker sourced from the local quarry. So everything is local. Glenwood Cemetery in Picton, Ontario's only woodland burial, where you have a good chance of seeing a deer while visiting your loved ones. Union Cemetery in Cobourg, a 1/4 acre running alongside Cobourg Creek. Here they dig the graves and the invasive species by hand. The lot is now full. Parkview Cemetery in Waterloo, 1 acre of beautiful meadow bursting with wildflowers in the summer. 2 osprey nests are close by.
Wow.
So sites in the works. There's a number of hybrid cemeteries with green options currently in the planning. Guelph, Hamilton, Halliburton Highlands, Owen Sound have recently approved hybrids. The one in Hamilton, I believe, is scheduled to open next year, and it already has a waiting list of people who have booked their plots. And then there are advocacy groups, and we hope to be one of them across the province, who are promoting the creation of natural burial grounds, both hybrids and standalones. So demand is growing. You can see some of the places across Ontario where communities like ours have formed local groups to advocate for standalone burial grounds or hybrid cemeteries that offer eco burials. So the reality is that Canada is behind the UK and the US. Most Canadians don't know about natural burial, but when they're told what it is, 53% find the concept appealing or very appealing. In the US, there are partnerships between land trusts and natural burial grounds. Land trusts in Ontario are interested. So, I'm wondering if there, maybe our partnership with Lambton Wildlife, they may be aware of some places that might be suitable for natural eco burials. These are things we could be exploring.
There's another Thames Talbot Land Trust, which is in London. They have a lot more properties than Lambton Wildlife. I think Lambton Wildlife has 2, maybe 3 at the most in their properties. The Thames Talbot Land Trust has many properties. So, I mean, that they have Joni's Woods. I'm sure some of you have heard of Joni's Woods. They own that one. And there's a number of other ones. So, I would put them on your list of organizations to contact.
Yeah, that's great, Brenda. That's great information. I know Leslie's making notes, right, Leslie?
Yes, I am.
Anything you want to add at this point?
No, I just, and one of the things though that's interestingly come up is in the UK, they haven't had much regulation at all. And what's happened is behind it, they've started to have to regulate, because what can happen when people are not regulating? I mean, we're over-regulated perhaps, but they are finding that anything goes. So you own a little bit of property, you're starting to have natural burials. So the good news in Canada, it's people aren't getting ripped off and they're not doing it without any regulations. But at the same time, as Alan pointed out, they've hundreds of choices compared to us.
Yeah, thanks, Leslie. Yeah, and I'm very surprised that it's so easy to open a natural burial ground in the UK. I'm from Northern Ireland, which is part of the UK, and growing up, I always thought of the UK as a highly bureaucratic culture. Everything was wrapped in red tape, and so it's a pleasant surprise to know that natural burials are not wrapped up in red tape.
And I think it's partly the consumer part of it too, is protecting consumers from maybe people who are not scrupulous in their acts.
Yeah. Certainly, regulations are important. So we'll get into that in a second. But first of all, why people love natural burial grounds? Our final act is giving back to the earth. Our resting place is in nature. It's more eco-friendly than current options. It's a more traditional approach. When you think of what generations past have done, it's basically what we're going back to the old ways of doing things. And our presence protects the land in its natural eco-habitat forever.
It's interesting when Alan says a more traditional approach, because there is a Green Society, Green Burial Society of Canada. And we understand, compared to what we're showing you here, which is following the natural burials of Ontario, and we'll get into that a bit later, but a funeral director on there from Ottawa said somebody was sort of thinking that it was kind of a new concept. And as he pointed out, it's really how our grandparents were buried. We're not really doing anything other than maybe markers, but the no embalming, putting you just in a pine coffin. That's probably how our ancestors would have been buried. So it is very traditional.
Exactly, yeah. So this is a hybrid cemetery in Thornbury, Clarksburg, which I think is near Collingwood. So I just put that on there. So they're going to be looking at offering eco burials, and the group there, are thinking outside the box. What else can we do when we get this area established? We can have pollinator gardens, beehives, sculptures, a memorial wall perhaps, birdhouses, walking trails, meadow and woodlot, educational opportunities, a kiosk, volunteer gardeners. So natural burial grounds celebrate nature in a myriad of ways. So approval process, launching a hybrid. So determine acreage, ideally an area that is in nature or surrounded by nature, or a natural space can be created. So if we were talking about a hybrid, you know, it would be a matter of forming a partnership with a cemetery in Lambton County, and they would offer us an area to be used for eco burials. So because it's already an existing cemetery, a lot of the red tape can be avoided. So this is one of the nice things about partnering with a current cemetery. It can be a lot cheaper, and you can avoid a lot of the regulations, whereas if you were starting from scratch. Assuming this is on land already zoned for cemetery use, hydrogeological studies may not be required. Yeah, anytime a cemetery wants to open, they have to make sure that the water table is at a sufficient depth. I believe it has to be under 3 feet from the surface. Otherwise, it's not suitable for a cemetery. You have to get medical officer of health approval. And then there's an organization called the Bereavement Authority of Ontario, BAO. This has been set up by the government of Ontario, but it's set up basically like a college to monitor cemeteries and funeral homes, make sure they're being run ethically and responsibly. And so the BAO must approve the bylaws specifically for the section of the cemetery that you would want to use for eco burials. So it's kind of like the College of Physicians or the College of Nurses, you know, it's an oversight, and it's there to protect, as Leslie mentioned, consumer protection. It oversees all aspects of funerals and burials to protect the consumer from being, you know, exploited financially, for example.
And so, Alan, to your point too, that we remember we were looking at a number of, when you said a natural space can be created, it's funny, in a number that we saw across the country, it was where they took the compost heap. So in a couple of places, they started the natural burial in the part of the cemetery where the compost heaps were from all of the brush and the grass clippings, and it was a natural fit to actually turn that into the natural burial ground. And also, I think the BAO, some of the worry that we've seen from the Natural Burial Association of Ontario is that part of it is also protecting the industry. So there has been concern, and they advocate on behalf of this group and people who would like natural burial, so that they have a voice in there with the industry.
Right. Yeah, so, you know, if a cemetery, as Leslie says, if a cemetery has an area that may already be suitable for eco burials and may not take a lot of developing. So that's the kind of cemetery we'd be looking at in order to form a partnership and have a hybrid option.
And Alan's pointing out the maintenance cost. Part of that is that they were explaining that 40%, you may be aware, up to 40% in Ontario is assigned to future maintenance of the plot. So when we buy a plot, you're actually paying 40% of that in Ontario for future ongoing maintenance, which is to protect municipalities that have been left with cemeteries that they now have to take care of.
Yeah, so let's, yeah, okay, we'll get back to that point, Leslie,
Okay.
I think in the next slide as well.
Sure.
But here's a couple of commonly asked questions. Will natural burial poison the water? No, in general, pathogens die when we do. There's no carrier to transmit them, and they don't travel through the soil. For eons, people have been buried this way with no ill effects. Regardless, the government has extra safeguards, and there must be 1 meter between the body and the water table. So that's why a cemetery has to get a hydrological assessment to make sure the water table isn't too high. It must be below the level of the grave. So yeah, you know, when you die, the pathogens die with you. There are some exceptions, rare exceptions. One would be smallpox, people who were buried with the smallpox virus, even centuries ago. There's a chance that that virus may still be viable if the bodies are recovered. But most pathogens will not survive very long. Will scavengers dig out the bodies? Too much work. If the body's buried 3 to 4 feet below the surface, they would rather find other food. As well, there's also the theory of a smell line at about 18 inches below the surface, and they can't smell below that. In the US, where there are lots of natural burials, there are no instances of scavengers digging up graves. So those are 2 common questions that a lot of people might have. And so we can put their minds at ease. So there's some things to consider in terms of costs, and Leslie has already touched on this. There's a new kind of cemetery dotting the landscape of the UK, US, and Australia. It's a natural burial ground run by a family or independent operator. Ontario regulations favor the status quo. In other words, the government and also the Bereavement Authority of Ontario tend to be anti-small business, anti-competitive, and basically they're not supportive of natural burial grounds. So that's one of the hurdles we have to overcome. We have to change the culture at the top. The Natural Burial Association that Leslie mentioned, who has provided most of these slides, by the way, and has really helped us in preparing this presentation. They are the main volunteer group challenging this mindset. And so they are anxious to get as much support as possible. So Leslie, I have the website for the NBA in the next slide, I think, but I think Leslie's going to put the websites, the links in the chat as well.
I have put it in the chat, and we can send an email out too after, if that helps. Right.
Okay. Yeah. So we encourage you to get you and your friends just to sign up on the Natural Burial Association website, and they will update you with what's going on locally. They have our postal codes, but the other main thing is that the larger the database that they have, then the more political clout they can have at Queen's Park. So Leslie mentioned that in Ontario, the 40% of the plot fee goes to the municipality, actually. And so that makes, so cemeteries basically have to jack up the price of their plot fees. And that makes Ontario the most expensive place in Canada to buy a burial plot. So the municipality takes the 40% of every plot fee and puts it into an account, because the municipality is ultimately responsible for the cemetery in its jurisdiction. And so it wants every cemetery to be financially sustainable. And if it's not, then the municipality can be on the hook for any costs. So you can see Ontario has the highest percent plot fee in Canada, and in Quebec it's 0%. And the other very sad fact is that if you want to open a new cemetery, if we found a piece of land that would be ideal for a natural burial ground, such as one of those places Brenda mentioned, someone would have to come up with $100,000, which is the fee you have to come up with to open a new cemetery. You avoid that fee if you're partnering with an existing cemetery. So that's another reason why I think a hybrid cemetery would probably be the best option locally here to begin with. And the other sad thing is that next year in Ontario, that $100,000 fee is going to increase by 65%, and it'll be $165,000 for anyone wanting to open a cemetery of any size. And you can see in other places, though, that fee does not exist. So there's a lot of obstacles. There's the anti-small business cultural attitude at the top level of the Ontario government and the funeral home industry. There's regulations, there's fees. So the hybrid option is probably our best bet. We have to increase public awareness. We have to build support. We have to get municipal and county buy-in, at least municipal buy-in. And that means at least getting one councillor to understand why we want this and why it's important and to advocate for it. So we need advocates on City Council to support us. Ideally, we'd like to get funeral home buy-in as well as cemetery buy-in. And as we mentioned, we need people to support the Natural Burial Association who are advocating at the top level with the government and with the Burial Association of Ontario. So Leslie has those links in the chat. And the third question is when? Well, it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take a lot of work before we are in a position to offer eco-burials in Sarnia. But just to end on a positive note, this is my last slide. The city of Sarnia 2 or 3 years ago invested in this ashes scattering site at the Sarnia Bay, down at the Pointlands. So this happened because the Hindu community approached one of the funeral homes and said, we would like to be able to scatter our loved ones' ashes on the water, as is the tradition in India. And so the funeral home went to City Hall and sold them on the idea. And the city built this little ramp down to the Sarnia Bay where people can come now and scatter ashes on the bay. So this is a precedent, you know, they have indicated that they're open to meeting the needs of the community. It's not just for Hindus, it's for everyone. And so I find this move pretty encouraging. So that's the end of the slide presentation. I'm sure you have